The garage door in Tallahassee hummed, a sound as routine as the morning commute. But when two bullets shattered the stillness of Trescott Drive in 2014, they didn't just end the life of a brilliant law professor. They ignited a decade-long pursuit of a family that believed they were above the law. This wasn't a street crime. It was a clinical, paid execution. Fast forward to 2023. A grandmother stands at a boarding gate with a one-way ticket to Vietnam, only to be met by handcuffs instead of a flight to freedom. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. To understand why a world-class academic would be targeted for a hit, you have to understand the two very different worlds that collided when Dan Markel met Wendy Adelson. Dan was an intellectual titan, a Toronto-born, Harvard-educated legal scholar who had transformed Florida State University's law school into a hub for cutting-edge criminal theory. He was a man of meticulous logic, a frequent traveler on the international lecture circuit, and the founder of an influential legal blog. In the halls of FSU, he was known as a brilliant, if sometimes rigid professor, who demanded excellence from everyone around him. He didn't just study the law, he lived it through a lens of strict morality and academic rigor. On the other side of the Florida Peninsula, 350 miles south of Tallahassee, sat the Adelson Kingdom. Based in Coral Springs, the Adelson family was the embodiment of South Florida's elite professional class. Harvey Adelson, the patriarch, was a celebrated dentist who had spent decades building the Adelson Institute into a multi-million-dollar empire of cosmetic and implant dentistry. His practice was a palace of polished marble and high-end aesthetics, catering to a clientele that expected perfection. But the true center of gravity in the family was Donna Adelson. Donna wasn't just a matriarch. She was the family's chief strategist and emotional architect. She operated with a fierce, almost suffocating loyalty to her children, viewing the world through a binary lens. You were either part of the Adelson inner circle, or you were an obstacle. Her life was a meticulously curated series of country club lunches, high-end real estate, and a constant, vibrating need to keep her children physically and emotionally close. Then there was Charlie Adelson, the middle child, and the family's resident enforcer. A successful periodontist by trade, Charlie lived a life that felt like a screenplay. He was a gym-obsessed playboy who drove Ferraris, frequented high-stakes poker games, and kept a foot in two worlds: the sterile precision of his surgical suite and the grittier underbelly of Miami's social scene. He was deeply bonded to his mother, sharing a shorthand of secrets and a shared disdain for anything or anyone that threatened the family's peace. Wendy Adelson was the princess of this dynasty. She was bright, blonde, and possessed a law degree of her own, but she lived under the immense shadow of her mother's expectations. When she and Dan married in 2006, it initially looked like the ultimate power couple, the brilliant scholar and the beautiful attorney. But the geography was the first crack in the foundation. Dan was tenured at FSU in Tallahassee, a town defined by rolling hills, Spanish moss, and a slower academic pace. To the Adelsons, Tallahassee was a backwater, a 7-hour trek from the civilization of South Florida. Donna viewed her daughter's life in the state capital as a form of exile. The tension grew as Dan and Wendy had two sons, grandsons, who became the absolute obsession of Donna Adelson. She didn't just want to visit them, she wanted to own their time. She frequently sent emails to Wendy, filled with thinly veiled contempt for Dan's control and his insistence on staying in North Florida for his career. As the boys grew, the friction between Dan's rigid intellectual world and the Adelsons' wealthy South Florida bubble reached a boiling point. Dan was a man who believed in rules and stability. Donna was a woman who believed that wealth and family loyalty should be able to bend any rule. In Donna's mind, Dan Markel wasn't just a son-in-law who lived too far away. He was an interloper who was keeping her daughter and grandsons hostage in a town she despised. The sunburn of Tallahassee was becoming an unbearable blister for the Adelsons, and the psychological stage was set for a solution that didn't involve a courtroom. The union of Dan Markel and Wendy Adelson didn't begin with a chance encounter in a coffee shop or a meeting in a law library. It began with the digital precision of a dating site. In 2004, the two found each other on JDate, a platform that promised a match of shared heritage and high-level ambition. To their respective families, it felt like the stars had aligned. Dan was the brilliant scholar with a global reputation. Wendy was the beautiful, accomplished daughter of a South Florida powerhouse. On paper, they were a match of equals, two high-functioning legal minds ready to build a legacy. Their 2006 wedding in Boca Raton was an exercise in Adelson opulence. It was a grand, multi-day affair where the family's wealth was on full display, a celebration that signaled the merging of an intellectual dynasty with a financial one. But even amid the champagne toasts and the intricate floral arrangements, the seeds of the coming tragedy were already being sown. The Adelsons were a tight-knit, almost insular unit, and Dan Markel was a man who belonged to no one but his own principles. The couple settled in Tallahassee, where Dan had secured a prestigious tenure-track position at Florida State University. Wendy joined him, eventually finding her own place within the university's clinical law program. For a few years, they played the part of the successful academic couple. They bought a home on Trescott Drive, a quiet, tree-lined street that felt like the epitome of suburban safety. Then came the children. Two sons were born in quick succession, boys who were the pride of Dan Markel's life and the absolute obsession of the Adelson family back in Coral Springs. But as the children grew, the geographical distance between Tallahassee and Miami began to feel like a chasm. Wendy started to feel the sunburn, a term she later used in a fictionalized novel to describe the suffocating, small-town atmosphere of Tallahassee. She missed the high-gloss lifestyle of South Florida, the proximity to her mother, the feeling of being at the center of the world rather than in a sleepy state capital. Donna Adelson didn't help matters. She maintained a constant digital tether to her daughter, sending a relentless stream of emails that analyzed every aspect of Wendy's life and marriage. Donna's messages were often scathing. She spoke of Dan in terms usually reserved for a political enemy, calling him vile, the adversary, and a man who was actively trying to diminish Wendy's light. She encouraged her daughter to push back, to stand up to Dan's control. In Donna's worldview, Dan's insistence on a stable home life in Tallahassee wasn't a commitment to his career or his children. It was a personal affront to the Adelson family's right to have their daughter close. By 2012, the relationship had decayed into a toxic standoff. Dan, ever the man of routine and order, believed they could work through their issues. Wendy, however, was already planning her exit, a plan that was executed with the clinical coldness of a military operation. In September 2012, while Dan was away on a short business trip, Wendy made her move. When Dan returned to the house on Trescott Drive, he didn't find a welcoming home. He found a shell. Wendy had moved out, taking the children, half the furniture, and even the electronics. The house was stripped, the silence echoing against the bare walls. He was served with divorce papers almost immediately. It was a surprise divorce, a calculated strike designed to leave him disoriented and powerless. But Wendy had underestimated Dan's resolve. He wasn't a man who would simply walk away from his children or his home. The legal war that followed was scorched earth. The central point of contention was relocation. Wendy filed a motion to move the children to South Florida, arguing that she needed the support system of her family. Dan fought it with every ounce of his legal brilliance. He argued that the boys needed their father, that their life was in Tallahassee. The judge agreed with Dan. The motion to relocate was denied. This was the moment the trap snapped shut. Wendy was legally tethered to a town she hated, living in close proximity to a man she now viewed with pure vitriol. To Donna Adelson, this was a catastrophe. Her daughter and grandsons were trapped by a man who refused to yield. The family discussed options that felt like something out of a dark satire. They talked about offering Dan a bribe, $1 million to simply go away and let Wendy move south. They even discussed a split custody arrangement that would involve the boys living in different cities. Dan rejected every overture. He wanted to be a father, not a paid-off spectator. The tension reached a fever pitch in the months leading up to July 2014. Dan had recently filed a motion to compel and a motion to limit Donna Adelson's contact with the children. He had become aware that Donna was speaking disparagingly about him to the boys, calling him stupid and a bad man. Dan sought a court order that would require Donna's visits to be supervised, a move that would have been the ultimate humiliation for the Adelson matriarch. To Donna, this wasn't just a legal maneuver. It was a declaration of war against her role as a grandmother. She spoke to her son, Charlie, about the problem of Dan Markel. The problem was a man who stood in the way of the Adelson family's total control. He was a man who used the law to protect his rights. And in the minds of the Adelsons, he was a man who had finally run out of time. The legal motions were set for a hearing, but Dan Markel would never make it to the courtroom. The solution would not be found in a judge's ruling, but in the dark connections of Charlie Adelson's Miami social circle. The air in Tallahassee on the morning of July 18, 2014, was a heavy, suffocating blanket of North Florida humidity. It was a Friday, the kind of day where the cadence of life usually slows down as the weekend approached. For Dan Markel, life was a series of scheduled blocks, a testament to his disciplined, academic mind. He was a creature of habit. He started his morning at Premier Health and Fitness, pushing through a workout that served as his mental reset before a day of research and child-rearing. He was a man who appreciated the structure of his life, unaware that the structure was being dismantled from the outside. But while Dan was lifting weights, two men were vibrating with a very different kind of energy. Sigfredo Garcia and Luis Rivera had been in town for days, lurking in a rented metallic green Toyota Prius, a vehicle so inconspicuous it was almost invisible in the leafy suburbs of the capital. They were a long way from home. They had driven hundreds of miles from the neon-soaked streets of Miami, sent on a mission that had nothing to do with the law and everything to do with a family's desperate solution. They had stayed at a cheap motel, eating fast food and waiting for the right window of time. They weren't professionals in the cinematic sense. They were hired muscle, blunt instruments, fueled by the promise of a payday that Charlie Adelson had allegedly facilitated through a middlewoman. They had done their homework. Earlier that morning, they were captured on city bus cameras and surveillance feeds, trailing Dan's silver Honda Odyssey with predatory patience. They watched him at the gym. They waited while he went about the most mundane tasks of fatherhood. At approximately 8:50 a.m., Dan finished his workout. He looked like any other suburban father, dressed in gym clothes, his mind likely drifting toward his upcoming legal projects. He picked up his two young sons from their home and drove them to their preschool, the Creative Child Learning Center. He walked them in, hugged them goodbye, and left. It was the last time they would feel the warmth of their father's embrace. As he pulled out of the parking lot, the green Prius was there, a silent shadow tucked into the morning traffic. They followed him to a nearby center where he dropped off some items, and then they trailed him as he made the short drive back to his home on Trescott Drive. The street was quiet. Neighbors were at work. The moss-draped oaks stood still in the heat. Dan pulled into his driveway. He pressed the button for the garage door. As the heavy door groaned upward, he stayed on his mobile phone, talking to a school official about his children's enrollment for the upcoming term. He was preoccupied. He was safe. He was home. The Prius pulled in right behind him, a jarring intrusion into the sanctuary of his garage. Luis Rivera watched from the car. Sigfredo Garcia stepped out. The window of the Honda Odyssey was up. Dan was still talking on the phone, his voice steady, discussing the future of his boys. He likely didn't even have time to register the face of the man standing by his driver's side door. There was no conversation, no warning, just the mechanical finality of a firearm. Garcia fired. The first bullet shattered the glass. It struck Dan in the head. He fired again. The second shot ensured the job was done. In a matter of seconds, the Prius reversed out of the driveway. It sped away, disappearing into the maze of Tallahassee's residential streets. Behind them, in the shaded gloom of the garage, the engine of the Honda Odyssey was still idling. The radio might have still been playing. And Dan Markel was slumped over the steering wheel, the life of a brilliant scholar leaking out onto the upholstery. A few minutes later, a neighbor heard what sounded like a loud bang, a sharp, discordant noise that didn't fit the neighborhood's soundtrack. He walked outside, curious, but not yet alarmed. He looked toward Dan's house. He saw the garage door was open. He saw the car. He saw Dan. The 911 call was a frantic exercise in disbelief. The neighbor told the dispatcher that he found his friend, that there was blood, that he wasn't breathing right. First responders arrived with a sense of urgency that usually skipped Trescott Drive. They found a man who was technically still alive, his body fighting a battle it had already lost. They rushed him to the hospital, but the damage was catastrophic. The legal scholar who had spent his life debating the nuances of justice was now a victim of its most primitive violation. While the police were cordoning off the crime scene, Wendy Adelson was living a life that seemed strangely disconnected. She spent the morning at her home, later claiming she had a Geek Squad appointment to repair a television, a detail that investigators would later find incredibly suspicious. Charlie Adelson had allegedly told a girlfriend that a TV repair was his secret code for a hit. It was a $3,000 repair for a television that cost much less, a numeric anomaly that pointed toward a payoff. Around noon, Wendy got into her car. She drove toward a liquor store to buy a bottle of bourbon for a party. Her route took her past the end of Trescott Drive. She saw the yellow tape. She saw the police cars. She saw the flashing lights. Later, she would tell investigators she thought it was a downed power line or a routine accident. She didn't stop. She didn't call Dan to see if he was okay. She simply turned around and went to lunch with her friends. They sat at a restaurant, eating and chatting, while Dan Markel lay dying in a trauma unit. It was during this lunch that she received the call. Her husband had been shot. Her reaction, witnessed by her friends, was described as a collapse into shock. But the police would soon begin to wonder if the shock was for the tragedy or for the fact that the problem had finally been solved. By the evening of July 18th, the news had sent shockwaves through the global legal community. Dan Markel was dead at 41. The university was in mourning. The Tallahassee Police Department was under immense pressure. They had a dead professor, no weapon, and a green Prius that seemed to have vanished into thin air. But as they began to look into Dan's life, every road led away from the quiet streets of the capital and straight down the Florida Turnpike, toward a family in South Florida that had been waiting for this day for a very long time. The investigation was only beginning, but the air of Tallahassee remained thick with the scent of a calculated betrayal. The blue walls of the interview room at the Tallahassee Police Department felt cold, a stark contrast to the stifling heat outside, where Dan Markel's life had just been violently extinguished. Wendy Adelson sat in that room for 5 hours, still wearing the clothes she had chosen for her lunch date. She was composed, yet fragile, a performance that investigators would later dissect with surgical precision. During that marathon session, she did something that seasoned detectives found deeply unsettling. She offered up a suspect before the police had even finished processing the crime scene. She told the detectives that her brother, Charlie, had joked about hiring a hitman as a graduation gift or a solution to her divorce, adding that it was his twisted way of saying he had her back. It was a joke that felt like a confession wrapped in a dismissal, a way to plant a seed of suspicion that she could later claim was just sibling banter. She spoke about the TV repair. She explained that a technician was supposed to come to her house that morning to fix a screen, a mundane detail that she clung to with strange intensity. To the officers, it seemed like an overconstructed alibi. People experiencing genuine, bone-shattering grief rarely worry about the scheduling of a Geek Squad appointment. She mentioned that Dan was a difficult man, that he was brilliant but rigid, and that their divorce was a nightmare of legal motions and vitriol. She wept, she sipped water, and she played the role of the blindsided widow, but she never once asked about the status of the investigation or if they had any leads on the shooters. Her focus was inward, on the unfairness of the situation and the burden it placed on her. While Wendy was in the interrogation room, the Adelson machinery in South Florida was already in high gear. There was no public statement of grief from Donna or Harvey. There was no offer of a reward for information leading to the capture of the killers. Instead, there was a wall of high-priced legal talent and a sudden, urgent silence. Within 48 hours of the shooting, the exile in Tallahassee was over. Wendy didn't stay to help the police. She didn't stay for the memorial services held by the university. She packed what was left of her life into a van and drove 7 hours south to the gated sanctuary of Coral Springs. The relocation that Dan Markel had fought so hard to prevent in court had been achieved through a caliber of violence the law couldn't anticipate. The move was more than just a change of address. It was an erasure. In the months that followed, the Adelsons reclaimed the boys with a chilling efficiency. The children, who had just lost their father, were quickly integrated into the Adelson lifestyle of country clubs and private schools. In a move that signaled the family's total victory, Wendy legally changed the boy's last name from Markel to Adelson. It was a symbolic stripping of Dan's legacy, a way to ensure that his name would not be carried forward by the sons he had died trying to protect. For Dan's parents, Ruth and Phil Markle, the tragedy was doubled. They had lost their son, and now they were being methodically cut out of their grandsons' lives. Donna Adelson was now the sole arbiter of the boys' future, and she had no intention of sharing them with the family of the man she had called vile. Behind the scenes, the Tallahassee Police Department was struggling. They had the motive. The Adelson solution was the talk of the town, but they lacked the physical bridge. They had surveillance footage of a metallic green Toyota Prius, a vehicle that looked like a ghost on the grainy tapes. They tracked the car through sun-scorched toll booths and traffic cameras, following its path from the North Florida capital all the way back to the outskirts of Miami. But a car isn't a person. They needed a name. They began looking into the TV repair check, a $3,000 payment for a television that cost a fraction of that amount. The numbers didn't make sense, unless the money wasn't for a repair, but for a down payment on a life. Suspicion began to harden around Charlie Adelson. The periodontist with the Ferrari and the high-stakes lifestyle was the obvious link to the world of hired muscle. Investigators started looking at his phone records, mapping out a web of connections that led to a woman named Catherine Magbanua. She was the mother of Sigfredo Garcia's children and, at the time, Charlie's girlfriend. She was the bridge between the sterile world of the Adelson Institute and the grittier reality of the hitmen. Yet even as the pieces began to align, the Adelsons remained untouchable. They lived their lives in the open, attending galas and building their dental empire, as if the blood on Trescott Drive was a distant memory. The case began to take on the weight of a cold investigation. The Tallahassee community was frustrated. The academic world was outraged. It seemed that money and status had bought the Adelsons a shield that the truth couldn't pierce. But the detectives weren't letting go. They were waiting for a crack in the family's armor, waiting for the hubris that often follows a successful crime. They knew that Donna Adelson was the puppet master, and they knew that Charlie was the enforcer. They just needed a way to make them talk. The aftermath of Dan Markel's death wasn't just a period of mourning. It was a long, silent stalemate between a family that thought they had won and a group of investigators who were determined to prove them wrong. The problem had been solved for the Adelsons, but the ghost of Dan Markel was about to become their most persistent witness. The metallic green Toyota Prius was a tactical mistake that the perpetrators likely thought was a stroke of genius. In their minds, a hybrid hatchback was the ultimate urban camouflage, a vehicle so synonymous with suburban errands that it would be invisible to the eyes of Tallahassee's finest. But to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement and the local detectives, the car was a digital breadcrumb. They began by scouring thousands of hours of highway footage and sun-pass toll records, tracking that specific shade of green as it moved across the state. They found that the car had been rented in Miami by a man named Luis Rivera, a high-ranking member of the Latin King street gang. He hadn't traveled alone. With him was Sigfredo Garcia, a man with a violent criminal history and a deep personal connection to a woman named Catherine Magbanua. Catherine, or Katie as she was known, was the linchpin. She wasn't a gang member or a career criminal. She was a mother of two and a professional who moved between two very different worlds. She worked as an assistant at the Adelson Institute, the very dental practice owned by Harvey and Donna Adelson. More importantly, she had been in a long-term relationship with Sigfredo Garcia, the father of her children. But by the summer of 2014, she was also the girlfriend of Charlie Adelson. The 6 degrees of separation had collapsed into a single, damning link. Investigators began to dig into Katie's finances, discovering a trail of ghost payments. She was receiving regular checks from the Adelson family business, checks signed by Donna Adelson for work she seemingly never performed. It was a payroll for silence, a financial tether designed to keep the middlewoman close. By 2016, the authorities had enough to arrest the hitmen. Sigfredo Garcia and Luis Rivera were taken into custody, but the masterminds in South Florida remained untouched. The Adelsons retreated further into their shell, hiring the best criminal defense attorneys Miami had to offer. They didn't speak. They didn't crack. To bridge the gap between the trigger pullers and the dentists, the FBI decided to rattle the cage with a sophisticated sting operation known as the bump. In April 2016, an undercover FBI agent posing as a representative of the hitmen approached Donna Adelson on a busy street in Miami. He called himself Joe. He didn't threaten her with violence. He threatened her with exposure. He handed her a newspaper clipping about Dan Markel's murder with a phone number written on it, telling her that his friend, Garcia, was in trouble and needed $5,000 to help his family. He was a blackmailer from a world Donna didn't understand. A normal person, innocent of any crime, would have immediately walked into the nearest police station to report an extortion attempt. Donna Adelson did the opposite. She retreated to her home and immediately picked up the phone. She didn't call the authorities. She called Charlie. The FBI had already secured wiretaps on their lines, and for the first time, the investigators heard the family's clinical facade begin to crumble. Donna was frantic. She spoke in a panicked, coded shorthand, telling Charlie that the man had approached her and knew everything. She described the encounter with a vibrating terror, asking her son how this could be happening. Charlie, ever the strategist, tried to calm her, but his own voice betrayed a frantic edge. They spoke about the paper and the need to take care of things, never once using the word murder, but the subtext was screaming through the receivers. The investigation reached its cinematic peak at a Miami restaurant called Dolce Vita. Charlie Adelson met Katie Magbanua there to discuss the blackmailer and the bump. The FBI had bugged the table, but the restaurant was a cacophony of clinking silverware and background chatter. Technicians spent months cleaning up the audio, but the visual evidence was already enough. Charlie was seen leaning in close to Katie, his body language suggesting a man who was fighting for his life. He discussed the possibility that the blackmailer was a cop, but he also debated whether they should just pay the money to make the problem go away. He was caught in a paradox of his own making. If he didn't pay, he risked exposure. If he did pay, he was admitting guilt. Despite the damning nature of the wiretaps and the Dolce Vita recording, the state attorney's office was hesitant. They had a mountain of circumstantial evidence, but they lacked a direct confession. They knew the Adelsons were the architects, but they needed to flip Katie Magbanua. For years, the case stalled. Katie went to trial and refused to talk, even as she faced life in prison. She remained loyal to the family that was paying her way. But the detectives weren't retreating. They were waiting for the generational arrogance of the Adelsons to provide the final opening. They had watched a brilliant man be executed in his garage, and they were willing to wait a decade if it meant the person who signed the checks finally faced the same bars as the person who pulled the trigger. The bump hadn't led to an immediate arrest, but it had poisoned the Adelsons' peace, turning their luxury condos into gilded cages where every ringing phone was a potential threat. The dominoes didn't fall at once. They tipped slowly over a decade of painstaking litigation. The breakthrough came in 2022 when Catherine Magbanua was finally convicted of first-degree murder. Faced with the prospect of dying in a cell, she finally broke her silence. Her testimony provided the direct link needed to haul Charlie Adelson into a Tallahassee courtroom in November 2023. Charlie tried to sell a desperate story, claiming he was the victim of an extortion plot by the hitmen. The jury took less than 3 hours to find him guilty on all counts. The conviction shattered the family's remaining hubris. Within days, Donna Adelson was caught on a wiretap discussing an exit strategy. On November 13th, 2023, she and Harvey arrived at Miami International Airport with one-way tickets to Vietnam. They never made it past the boarding gate. Donna was handcuffed at the terminal. The matriarch, who had once controlled every aspect of her children's lives, was led away in tears, finally forced to face the law she had spent a lifetime trying to outrun. The Adelsons thought their wealth and prestige made them untouchable, but the law Dan Markel spent his life teaching finally caught up to them. Donna Adelson, once the queen of a dental empire, now resides in the very system she tried to circumvent. The boys, now bearing the name Adelson, will one day learn the bitter truth about the man who died to keep them in his life. Justice moved slowly, but in the end, the professor won his final case. The contract was closed, but the cost was an entire family's soul. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video.